Hello and welcome everyone to a very special edition of Altitude. My name is Jane Johnston. I'm part of the NATS team and I'm delighted to be hosting you for this month's episode. I used to work for British Airways and I was lucky enough to fly on Concorde a few times myself, but not as many times as my first guest, Mike Bannister. He was Concorde's youngest pilot when he joined the fleet and went on to be Chief Concorde Pilot for 8 years until she was retired, amassing a total of 9,200 Concorde flight hours, almost 700 of them supersonic. My second guest is Air Traffic Controller Brian Ringrose, who is now a Group Supervisor and Gatwick Approach Controller at Swanwick. But 20 years ago, he was at Heathrow Tower, where he gave Captain Les Brodie the last ever Concorde departure clearance. For more than 25 years, Concorde was the queen of the sky, the world's only successful supersonic airliner, flying faster than the rotation of the Earth. She could cross the Atlantic in less than 3 hours, arriving at JFK before she left Heathrow. The last time Mike and Brian had any contact, it was through headsets on the 26th of November 2003, as Concorde awaited clearance for her final departure from Heathrow. A quick reminder to everyone watching that you can submit your questions to Mike and Brian during the show, and we will get to as many as we can later on. I have to say we've got quite a few coming through already. I think this is going to be quite iconic. So can I just say to both of you, I'd like you both to think about what you remember about that final flight. Mike, I'd like you to tell us how you were feeling as you lined up at the end of the runway. And Brian, was it just another day or was it a very special moment? We've got a little bit of RT here that we're just going to play, which might give you some reminders.
Speedbird, Concorde Alpha Foxtrot. You're cleared for takeoff 27 right, surface wind 250 degrees, 11 knots. We'll all miss you.
Likewise, and for the very last time, clear to take off, runway 27 right, Golf Alpha Foxtrot.
How does that make you feel, Mike?
It brings back wonderful memories. Hi, Jane. When we were first within BA discussing the possibility of retiring Concorde, as you might imagine, I argued against it. My view was that the commercial grounds for retiring it were short-term, that cyclical business like aviation, the good times would come back and we should hang in there. But my argument didn't carry the day. So then you're faced with a choice, aren't you? Do you throw your toys out of the pram and resign, or do you accept collective responsibility and get on with it? Well, I chose answer B. And my determination when they put me in charge of the retirement program was to make sure it was a celebration and not a wake, all the way through the whole of the retirement process, right up until that last flight on November the 26th. So at that moment, I was in celebration mode. Yeah, we were very mindful of that awful accident in Paris, but that wasn't the reason why BA retired the airplane. We just wanted to ensure that we celebrated 27 years of successful supersonic operation. So it was celebration all the way through that. When we arrived at Filton, when we went to the reception, it wasn't until all of that was over and one of my pilot colleagues, Paul Douglas, invited the five of us back to his house in Bath for a bite to eat and relax and shoot the breeze, that really that's the time when the sorrow and the tears kicked in, but that was way out of the public view.
You weren't actually at the controls yourself that day. What did it, I mean, how hard was it to give up that left-hand seat?
Well, it's always hard because Concorde's such a fantastic airplane to fly. So any opportunity to fly, one would grab with both hands. But my colleagues in the British Airways press office wanted me to do the last flight from New York to London, because from a commercial and PR perspective, that was the more important of the two. That one we could plan a long way in advance. We knew it was going to be October the 24th. The ones where we took the airplanes off to the various museums, of which Filton was the last, we hadn't set that schedule until about a month before retirement, and it was a very fluid schedule as well. So I did the one where we came back from New York to London, and then two of my managers, Les Brodie and Paul Douglas, I asked them to toss a coin for who's going to actually do the last flight. Les won, and I believe Paul did the takeoff and Les did the landing. So it's Leslie's voice you could hear on air traffic control.
And how was it? How was it for you, Brian? Because that was actually your voice that we heard there.
Yeah, so for me, it is an incredibly proud and emotional moment. So not many people will realise this, but it was picked up by the news that my voice was quite emotional. Yes, it is emotional because of Concorde leaving, because that's what made us all really proud to be working at Heathrow Tower. We routinely dealt with Concorde, and we were really proud that we were like the place where Concorde came in and out of daily. But on that day as well, it was extremely special to me, because 6 months prior to that, I lost my big brother, who I really looked up to a cancer of brain tumour. And when I was given what I said to Concorde and to the crew, he was very much on my shoulder that day. So that's why I was slightly emotional as well. But the moment was just amazing, just to be able to be part of that moment in history. It's a kind of bittersweet moment in history, but because it felt like we took a massive step backwards in terms of passenger travel, passenger air travel at that. But for me, it was a really special moment, and something both I'm proud of myself, but also made my parents really proud as well.
Yeah, that must have been very poignant. How did you actually get to be chosen for it? Did you actually toss coins in the tower?
So the way we did it, I was really fortunate that day. We had a relief watch manager, and his name, and I will say his name, Angus McCormack was our relief watch manager that day, and he was all about fairness, and he did everything above board and fairly. So back then we still used paper strips, and I think we all used to have to put our name down, and I think it was down to a lighting panel operator who worked with us in the tower to draw names, and I was just extremely lucky that my name was drawn. There were several other people obviously that got to speak to Concorde on its way out, because it's a team effort in the tower. In fact, air traffic full stop is very much a team effort, from the ATSARs that deliver us the flight plan details that we need, to the lighting panel operators in Heathrow Tower. And then as you make your way through Heathrow Tower, you start off on delivery, then to ground, and then finally to me in one of the air positions. And I was looking after runway 27 right that day, clearing it for takeoff.
And there was an American Airlines pilot who actually came onto the RT as well and said, "Concorde, you're beautiful." And you were saying that to me earlier that he was desperate to be next one off the runway after Concorde. That's
exactly it. Yeah. So I sat there and I was getting all these strips delivered. So in the old tower, we used to have plastic holders in. I used to have one here, which used to get, it was very much like a train set, and the strips would be delivered down to you down a chute. So they were building up, and I even said to Concorde on the day, no one will go until you do, so line up and let me know when you're ready to depart. And so I just had to sit and wait with all these planes building up. So as soon as the Concorde went, that's it, I had to really work hard to get the queue back down, to stop any delays building.
I love it. We always used to set our watches by Concorde. I mean, when I was at BA, you'd hear the roar of the engines at 10:30 and you'd look at your watch because Concorde was always on time. You must have given her preferential treatment. You're amongst friends. You can tell us.
So from my perspective in the tower, I would say the only preferential treatment it got was by virtue of the fact it normally had what we call an oceanic slot time. So because Concorde was so fast, we used to get its departure clearance and oceanic clearance both at the same time. So Concorde would call us about 10 to 20 minutes before they were ready to depart, saying what time they were ready to push back, and we would get a slot time. So a lot of the time, it just got preferential treatment purely because it was the only aircraft at the holding point with a slot time. So we would have to push it to the front of the queue to make sure we hit that slot window. And the slot window is from -5 minutes to 10 minutes after the slot time that's been issued. So that's the only preferential retreatment we gave it really in the tower. because it was just like any other aircraft. You have to use that runway as efficiently as possible.
And you never asked for any special favours, Mike?
Perish the thought. No, of course, we put a huge amount of effort within British Airways to getting the airplane away on time, because not only were we selling speed, we were selling comfort, punctuality, the ability to buy back time, all those wonderful things. But it made a package, and that's why I so often hear people say that they used to set their clocks by Concorde the time that we'd always come over. But Brian's absolutely right. We knew we wouldn't get any preferential treatment from air traffic. There was a process within British Airways where sometimes internally we would swap our aircraft around in the stack coming into Heathrow, to try and get Concorde on the ground closest possible to its scheduled arrival time. But that was a totally internal process, and it didn't affect anybody outside the British Airways loop.
So nobody got preferential treatment. It all worked like clockwork.
No.
Okay, no. I'll let you off in that case. Quite a lot of people asked us that question, so thank you for that one. Mike, let me ask you what stands out as highlights over the years that you spent flying Concorde. What were your highlights, and maybe one or two of your lowlights as well?
Gosh, with the highlights, we could be here all afternoon chatting. I suppose three particularly stick in my mind. The first time when I actually flew the airplane, I'd already done 4 months training, 2 months on the technical stuff, chalk and talk on how the systems work, 2 months on the simulator, how to work the systems, and then for the first ever time to fly the airplane for real, taking off on what's called base training for a series of takeoffs and landings. And the captain sitting next to me, I was a first officer at the time, said, "Right, Mike, I want you to climb straight ahead and level off at 2,500 feet, if you can." And I thought, what do you mean if I can? Of course I can. I'm an experienced pilot. The airplane was very light, only 120 tons, but we use the same power and reheat that we use when it's heavy at 185 tons. So it goes like a rocket. And that was the internal nickname for the airplane, the Rocket. I opened up the throttles to full power, pushed back in the seat, continual acceleration, didn't really know what was going on. The next thing I realized, we're up at 4,000 feet, and I'm looking across at the captain, who's laughing his head off. He said, "Don't worry, Mike." He said, "Everybody does that." So I guess that really impressed on me the power of the airplane. I guess the second time was flying down the Mall with the red arrows for the Queen's Golden Jubilee celebrations. That was fantastic. I mean, not only 1,000 feet above the Mall, over 1.5 million people in formation with the world's premier aerobatic team, but you could actually see Her Majesty standing on the balcony as we came over the Barbican Centre. And I suppose lastly, the very last flights, and the one that really sticks in my mind is the very last commercial flight, where after we had the flight part and we'd done the press part, we had a big reception in a hangar at BA. And at the end of that, at 10:30 in the evening, October the 24th, I was the last person standing. And I went across the tarmac to get into my car. And it was one of those misty October evenings with the sodium lights going. And I looked, and there were 5 perfectly serviceable Concordes that would never carry another fare-paying passenger. And again, that's the time when the tear came to my eye. But there are many, many other memories. And I guess that one was probably the low light as well.
Was she difficult to fly?
Absolute dream. You could fly her with your fingertips. She was rather like a thoroughbred racehorse rather than a riding school hack or a sports car rather than a truck. And I did. I have flown her with my fingertips all the way across the Atlantic on a very strange occasion where both autopilots packed up. But she was a delight. You could do that. And a lot of my colleagues flew the airplane far more often manually than they ever did automatically on other airplanes.
And Brian, other pilots used to want to hang around on the airfield to see Concorde, didn't they?
Yeah, occasionally you'd get people saying, "Can we go after Concorde?" Just purely because they just wanted to see it go. I mean, I've experienced it myself. One of the things we used to do when you trained to be a Heathrow Tower controller is you would get an airfield driving license, and one of them things you'd do would be to go out on the airfield. And one of the things we used to do all the time would drive right to the very end of the runway, because we could get as close as we possibly could and wait for Concorde to go. And that sheer power as they light those afterburners just was something else. I really wish I could describe that to new people that are entering the job, because they will never, unless something else comes along in the future, they will never get that experience. And to experience that sheer power and have it reverberating through your chest whilst you're sat in a car was just something else.
Well, I remember the British Airways HQ at Waterside, which is a good couple of miles from the end of the runway. And when Concorde took off again for the first time after the Paris crash, the entire roof of Waterside was lined with people just waiting. We couldn't really see anything, but we could hear it. And this huge cheer went up from everybody when we heard the roar of Concorde taking off down the runway again. Mike, when you heard about the accident in Paris, did you feel in your bones that this was the end for Concorde? Oh, we've lost your sound, Mike.
Definitely not. My only reaction was totally different to what I might have expected it to be. If you'd asked me before that awful accident how I'd react, I think I'd have said something like, it won't happen, it will be awful for the aviation industry, it'll be awful for the Supersonic project, something like. It wasn't like that at all. My initial reaction when I first heard was for the people, the 109 people on the airplane and the 4 people on the ground who were killed. And my first action was to ring my counterpart at Air France, Egashio, who had just arrived at the accident site. And he described to me what he could see and the awful things that had happened. But what sprang into my mind then was clearly there's going to be a big investigation, and it is possible that the airplane might get grounded for a short period of time. We've got to help with the investigation. We've got to support it in every way we possibly can. We'll try and ensure that the airplane doesn't stop, but if it does, we'll get it going again as soon as possible. So the thought of it being grounded there and then because of the accident really never crossed my mind.
Well, I remember being in the hangars when the Kevlar was being fitted to the insides of the fuel tanks on the British Airways fleet. And you were very much involved in getting Concorde back in the air again, weren't you? I mean, how much drive did you need to keep that going?
Well, in hindsight, a lot, but at the time it just seemed the natural thing to do. This was the British Airways flagship. It was literally unique. There are only 2 airlines in the world that ever flew it. It had a huge following. Despite what many people think, it had made a lot of profit for British Airways. It set the airline apart from all the other airlines in the world except Air France. And it was the flag bearer, the standard bearer for the company in that sense. And so to me, it was self-evident that the airplane needed to be back in the air where she belonged and needed to continue flying for as long as possible. And we had a really, really strong card of regular customers. A lot of folks think that our regular customers were the celebrities and the film stars. Well, there were some of those, but 80% of our customers were business people. And of those, 80% of those were repeat customers. So it was a business person's airplane. The chief execs, chief operating officers, chief financial officers of major companies used it very efficiently because they could do in 2 days what would otherwise take 4. And if you're at that level in a company, time literally is money. So for the top executives in companies, it was actually cheaper to do your business via Concorde than it was by a subsonic because it took half the time.
And one of the other favourite anecdotes that we had that we used to entertain journalists with was the fact that Concorde stretches in flight.
Yeah, it does, of course, because if you think about it, it's going to get heated up. It travels through the air so quickly that friction and compression heat the structure up. So the nose of the airplane could get as high as 127 degrees Celsius, the wings and the fuselage up to 100 degrees Celsius, the boiling point of water. Now, fortunately, the designers had guessed that was going to happen, and so they built in the ability for the airplane to stretch during the design process. And it could stretch between 6 and 10 inches, depending on how long you were flying at Mach 2. There was only one place on the airplane where you could see that, and that was between the flight engineer's panel and the bulkhead next to it, which would open up in supersonic flight. On the ground, I could just about get my fingertips in that gap. In the air, you could get your whole hand in there. And because Concorde was the last airplane in British Airways that had dedicated flight engineers, On the last flights of the airplanes, as we took them off to the museums, we put the flight engineer's hat in that gap so that when the airplane decelerated and cooled down, the gap would close and the hat would be trapped there forever, or at least until Concorde flew supersonically again.
What a nice thing. So there are 5 engineers' hats tucked inside Concordes to this very day.
Well, there were, but 2 of those 5 were pinched pretty quickly after we arrived. Well, 1 was taken out and subsequently replaced. So I think there are 3 still existence in the 5 airplanes that were in the fleet at the end.
Well, who knew? Somebody's going to be going fishing now, aren't they, to see if there's one behind the one they have access to.
If you see one on eBay, let me know.
Not if I get there first, I tell you. Brian, did you and the other controllers get to build a relationship with the Concorde pilots? Because they were a very small fleet.
They were only over the radio. There might have been people. Obviously, you've got to remember back then I was really new in my career. I'd only been valid just under 2 years. Valid means being a controller on your own, operating on your own with no one looking over your shoulder. So for me, I was still relatively new in the job, which made it even more special for me. The fact that I was given this honour being relatively junior in the tower. I thought surely someone senior had dealt with Concorde, but it was done so fairly. It was really nice. But I'm pretty sure there is people. Certainly, my old watch manager knew Les Brodie, so there were relationships amongst the controllers because we just knew each other because we were talking to each other. Same as I have a friend now who's a captain with British Airways. If you're in the industry, you just generally build up relationships with people in different careers that are in the aviation industry.
And did you have to give Concorde special treatment? I know you didn't give her preferential treatment, but did you have to make any special provisions for her? Or did you have to give her more airspace, less airspace? So
firstly, it was the only aircraft we ever got an oceanic clearance for because it just went too fast. Every other aircraft that's going transatlantic would get airborne out of Heathrow and they would get their oceanic clearance en route. So that was special in that way. The only other way we had to do it was if you were following Concorde, you could immediately go behind it as long as you were the same, what we call wake turbulence category. So for instance, if Concorde went on its standard departure, we could follow that up immediately with another 747 going exactly the same way. And pretty much soon as Concorde's wheels were off the ground, we could clear the 747 for takeoff because it was never going to catch it. So we would do that routinely, and we'd quite often do that purely because it was a massive runway benefit to use the runway as efficiently as possible. The only problem is if you are in front of Concorde, and if that was the case, we need to have a good space between you. So we normally would wait 2 minutes if you were going a different direction to Concorde, but if you were in front of Concorde on the same route, I believe it was about 4 minutes we had to wait before we could launch Concorde behind you. And even then, Concorde was going to overtake you. It was going to happen. It's just, it gave them 4 minutes to get airborne and through a noise abatement level, so the controllers at radar could vector you out the way, I guess. I don't know. I never did radar back then, but I'd imagine that was part of the reason for that, as well as the massive speed differential with Concorde. It accelerated so quickly.
There was a woman on the who was interviewed at the time who said she didn't like aeroplanes, but she did like Concorde. She loved Concorde, and I think a lot of people forgave Concorde for being so noisy, simply because she was so beautiful. But she was also very fuel thirsty, Mike, wasn't she? I mean, given the environmental impact of Concorde, do you think she would still be flying today?
There's so many misapprehensions about Concorde, and sadly, Jane, that's one of them, that she was fuel thirsty. Yeah, she burned fuel at a far greater rate than a conventional airplane because she was traveling over twice as fast. But when she came into service, the 747s that were around at the time used more fuel going from London to New York than Concorde did. Concorde was more efficient in terms of fuel per mile than a 747 of the earlier days. Now, clearly, the 747 went through many iterations. It became more and more and more efficient. But in terms of miles per gallon per passenger, you could get 19 miles per gallon per passenger out of a Concorde, which is far better than most people anticipate. Nowhere near as good as I get out of my hybrid, of course, but you know, the airplane was designed in the 50s and 60s, and in the cars and airplanes of those eras couldn't do anything like that. And so it's an amazing tribute to the designers that made the airplane, that it had the ability to last so long. So it's in service for 27 years before the commercial pressures meant we retired the airplane in 2003. She could probably have carried on a technical basis for about another 12 to 15 years. So maybe 2015 to 2018, something like that, before the technical side of it would have probably meant the cost of keeping the airplane in service was so high that we just couldn't do it anymore. And one of the most important part of that was there was a test specimen at Farnborough on the ground that was always kept heated and cooled, stretched and compressed to make sure it had more simulated flight cycles than the highest time airplane. And in the 80s, that test specimen was decommissioned because they said, well, we've got so many cycles now, no Concorde will ever do as many as that. But round about the 2015 mark, had we kept going, we'd have caught up with that test specimen. So then there would have had to have been major maintenance work on the airplane.
Okay, so the idea of supersonic flight is not, in your view, environmentally unsustainable. The reason I'm asking is because obviously there is a concept aircraft being considered at the moment, Boom, which is a much bigger aircraft than Concorde was. I think it seats 300 people, whereas Concorde seated 100. Do you think there is a future for supersonic flight?
Well, I certainly do. I mean, I'm an optimist. My glass is always half full. I don't think that the human race wants to take backward steps for very long. My daughter's a pilot, and she was 6 years old when the accident happened, and she's now just coming up to 30. She's an instructor with TUI, and she wants to fly a supersonic aircraft. And I believe that'll happen. The Boom Overture is very Concorde-like. I mean, the initial concept is to fly only 55 passengers on the early models, and that ironically it was the average load factor for Concorde throughout its entire life with BA was 55 to 58%, sometimes absolutely chock-a-block full. It will travel a little slower, Mach 1.7, same altitude, 60,000 feet, greater range. It will be environmentally friendly, use sustainable aviation fuel, as Virgin did yesterday crossing the Atlantic, and all the environmental regulations that come in or will come in during its lifetime. And the prospect for the customer would be, would you be prepared to pay 20% more to get there in half the time? Now, Concorde was a 100 seats supersonic class, which was first class plus. Boom Overture, the plan is for it to be a conventional configuration, a traveller, a business class and a first class configuration. So would you pay 20% more to get there in half the time? I believe many people would, and I believe there's a real future for it. And of course, aviation is doing a huge amount to try and minimize its impact on the environment. And that's from a base where aviation worldwide only contributes just under 2% of carbon emissions. Many people think it's about 30%, but it's not. It's only about 2%. But nonetheless, aviation is doing its absolute utmost to minimize the environmental impact of aircraft. It's in our interest to do it.
Absolutely. It's an existential challenge, isn't it, for all of us? So just a final question from me before we go on to some of the questions from our viewers. Who is your favourite passenger?
Mine?
Yeah.
Oh gosh, that's difficult. I guess two particularly spring to mind. One was Tom Watson, the golfer, and the other was Rudolf Nureyev, the dancer. Rudolf Nureyev, in the days when we could invite people onto the flight deck, came up on the flight deck one day, and he and I got chatting, and I'm a huge ballet fan. And I actually said to him, you know, what's your favourite ballet to have danced? And he ummed and ahed and said, Hamlet, when I danced it at the Royal Opera House at Covent Garden in 1976. And I said, I was there. I was actually at that performance. I'd gone up there on spec, not really knowing the form, rocked up at the box office, said, have you got any tickets? And it just so happened there were 2 returns immediately before me. I went and watched the first half, not knowing it was Nureyev. And then in the interval, I was chatting and somebody leant over to me and said, do you not realise that actually was Nureyev? When I said, that dance is almost as good as Nureyev. And so he turned to me and said, well, there we are. That's perfect. You know, we've watched each other work. And the other one was Tom Watson, who's such a delightful chap. And he was so wonderful to us the time that he won the Open. We took him and other American golfers back to the States, and he actually brought the claret jug, the Open trophy, up onto the flight deck for us to look at it and have photographs taken with him and the claret jug. And the chief stewardess came back up and said, Mr. Watson, your lunch is ready. So he went back and left the claret jug on the flight deck for us to continue taking photographs. I never did tell him that I dropped it on the center console. There was a big dent in it, but, you know, I turned it away so he didn't see that when he came back to get it.
Fabulous. Thank you for that. Right. Well, we've got a question here from Dren. Did a Concorde departure out of Heathrow require a pre-note or coordination with any airspace sectors?
I guess I'm answering that. So but only by virtue of the pre-startup call we'd get from the captain or first officer saying we'll be ready to go, and then that was our cue to go and get Concorde's oceanic clearance. So that was the only pre-note per se, was just finding out its oceanic clearance and its oceanic slot times. But other than that, the radar controllers over at West Drayton, as it was then, were all down at Swanwick now. They would see it on the departure board and they'd know it'd be coming. So we just launched it at an appropriate time, making sure we separated it against traffic in front of it.
I think it did need a fair amount of flexibility and forward thinking from air traffic control, though, because the airplane could do amazing things, especially at lightweight. I can remember once taking off from Heathrow on the 9s, and there'd been a fuel strike at Heathrow. So we told all the BA aircraft to arrive at Heathrow with as much fuel on board as possible, including Concorde. And the only way to get to New York was to take off very lightweight from Heathrow and do a technical stop at Shannon to refuel. So on this particular occasion, we had about 70 passengers on board, but we were really lightweight. And we took off with full power, as we always did, with a reheat, off on the 9s, turned around and came back in the opposite direction. Well, the rate of climb of that aeroplane under those circumstances was phenomenal. And when we went back past Heathrow going westbound, we were at 27,000 feet. And I think at the time I can remember thinking air traffic control must have known we were going to do something like that. So, yeah, it did take a lot of forethinking and a lot of cooperation from air traffic.
We've got a question from Robbie. What was the turbulence like on Concorde in the lower levels? So flight level 350 and below, for example.
Well, I guess that's mine. Well, much less than a conventional airplane, or the effect was much less, because you're longer, you're thinner, you've got a small wingspan, you've got no high profile fuselage, and you're going through that area of turbulence much more quickly. So yes, we still got turbulence, but the effect of it was far less. And as you said, above about flight level 350 to 400, you're up and away from all of that, and the flight was very smooth.
We've got a question from Linda, which is, I loved reading your book. This is for you again, Mike. Did you keep a diary during your time flying and teaching, apart from your logbook? Because the details are amazing. It can't all be from memory, surely.
Well, it was actually from memory. It's something I've been toying with for ages, and thank you for reading it. It came out last year. It's just called Concorde, surprisingly enough. And it's funny because I read a book called Harrier 809 by a chap called Roland White. Fab book. It's all about the Harrier operations in the Falklands. And when I'd read it and thought this is wonderful, I was actually read the last page, and it said, if you've enjoyed this book, why don't you email the author at rolandwhite.com or whatever it was. So I thought, you know, I will. I never get a reply, but I will. So I emailed him, and at the very end I put, P.S. I'm toying with the idea of writing a book. Well, I didn't know that Roland, as a writer, is a part-time exercise. He's actually a senior publishing editor for Penguin Random House. And I got a reply almost immediately saying, we need to talk. And that was kind of the beginning of it. But it was I'd been thinking about it for 20 years, but it all came out of memory rather than from notes. I didn't keep notes. I found that keeping a diary, it might have too much information in it. So no, it's all from memory.
Well, it's all on social media now as opposed to a diary, isn't it?
Well, quite, yeah.
We've got a question here from Graham, and again, Mike, I think this one is for you. I would like to know if Captain Bannister ever visited the control tower to see how the ATC side worked. I was an air traffic engineer working in the tower at the time and have many happy memories of working there in the 90s.
Yeah, absolutely. Not just at Heathrow, but at several of the Concorde destinations around the world, particularly in New York and New York Oceanic. Yeah, for a number of reasons. A, it was clearly important for us as pilots to understand the pressures that air traffic control are under, the things that they can and can't do, and how sometimes requests that we might make that seem very simple to us are somewhat more difficult. To build relationships with controllers, that's really important, and also to facilitate a return match, because there were times when we had visits to the control tower and we were able to invite some of the controllers back to fly with us so that they could understand what flying on a Concorde was like compared to flying a conventional airplane, and why we asked for some of the requests that we did. So the working liaison was very good. We didn't do the visits as often as I'd like to have done because everybody's busy doing other things, but it was a very strong relationship throughout the entire life of the airplane.
Brian, did you ever get to fly on Concorde?
No, unfortunately, I never did. I really wish I had. There was a friend of mine who was valid not long after me, and I believe they did some sort of strange ticket where you could go Concorde one way, 747 back, and he took up that opportunity. So yeah, I'm kind of gutted I never really got the opportunity to do it. I really wanted to, but yeah, sadly no.
There's a question from Paul. Did the controllers see Concorde as special? How did they feel during those final flights?
So for me personally, yes, I always felt really special because we were dealing with Concorde on a daily basis. So it felt really great. You know, Heathrow Tower was my first posting straight out of the college. So I was extremely proud to have been given that opportunity to go straight to Heathrow and validate my air traffic license at Heathrow. Because I always dreamt of wanting to work in aviation. I didn't know in what guise, because I worked for a small company, the work experience at school at British Air Ferries, working on Vickers Viscounts, which Mike will know from his book. And I was an air cadet myself, and still am working with the Air Force now as an instructor. So I always had this passion that I wanted to, like Mike with flying, I just knew I wanted to be in the aviation industry. So it felt really special that I was given the opportunity to go to Heathrow and be one of the team that cleared Concorde to take off and land on a daily basis.
And you were very young at the time. And Mike, you were the youngest pilot to join the Concorde fleet. How old were you when you joined the Concorde fleet?
I was just 28, and yeah, because I always wanted to be a pilot right from the age of 7, and it was always my dream, and it came to fruition. And I was finalising my training in 1969, and that's when Concorde first flew. And I thought, that's what I want to do. Want to be a Concorde pilot. And of course, with the precociousness of, well, then a 19-year-old, it never crosses your mind you're not going to do it. So it was always my longer-term objective, and I was very lucky. I got 2 bites of the cherry. So from 77 to 89 as a co-pilot and latterly an instructor, and then I went off to the 111, the 757, 767, a bunch of other management jobs in BA before I got a phone call from the boss who said, Mike, would you like to be the Chief Concorde Pilot? And I said, well, I'm going to think about it. I've thought about it, yes. And that was it until the airplane retired in 2003. So yeah, it was this 7-year-old boy's dreams came to fruition. It was a fantastic time. I was really, really privileged and honored to have that opportunity in my career.
Oh, it's really great to have the two of you here, and that you got to the peak of so young. I'm incredibly respectful of that. I've got another question from Matt. Was there any specialist training for ATCOs in controlling Concorde? Aerodrome, lower, upper airspace? Was there anything different?
So we as controllers operate to 2 manuals. So you have a manual of air traffic services part 1, which is like national procedures and things like that. And believe it or not, back then when I first joined the job, Concorde, I believe, had its entire section all on its own. So we could know what sort of special handling Concorde would need. So in terms of that was the training we would get. You would have to know some of that manual. In terms of the aerodrome training, we would be mindful of, and Mike might be able to correct me on this, but we were also mindful that sometimes where Concorde used to park in Terminal 4, it would literally turn right and it would be at the runway holding point. And that was too short a taxi for Concorde. So sometimes it would get to the holding point and actually it hadn't burnt enough fuel off. So it'd have to burn enough fuel off to be able to depart on time. But you know, Mike will correct me, I'm sure, on that.
No, that's absolutely right. And we had to, if the airplane was absolutely full of fuel, then we had to burn enough off to make space to pump the fuel from the back of the airplane forward to get the center of gravity in the right place for takeoff. So sometimes it seems bizarre that you're short, you know, you want as much fuel as possible and you have to sit on the ground and burn some off before you can go. But it was one of those rather strange quirks of the way we always operated the airplane. So it did happen occasionally, but not too often.
Did you have a favourite Concorde, Mike?
Yeah, the one I most recently flew. Some of my colleagues said they could tell the difference between the 2 airplanes. Personally, I couldn't. They were all constructed to be identical, and to me they were. Perhaps I'm not sensitive enough to pick up the differences.
So which one was the favourite, sorry?
The last one I flew. Okay. Always the last one.
Always the last one you flew. Well, you see, I have a special soft spot for Alpha Foxtrot because that was the one on the far side of the formation flight that we've seen some pictures of today, and I was on it. I was on that Concorde in the formation flight, revisiting my mince pie and my glass of champagne several times over, I think. But so I have a special place for Alpha Fox. Gareth is asking, Mike, did you ever feel like the plane would let you down?
Oh, absolutely not. I mean, I think if, as a pilot, you think that the airplanes are going to let you down, you might be in the wrong career. As a pilot, Concorde was very, very reliable. You knew how well engineered she was. Because it was the first airplane of its type and it was doing things that no other airplane had ever done before. And I don't mean no other passenger airplane, no other airplane had been done before. The designers did a wonderful job of making sure that there was redundancies over and above what you'd conventionally get. So a conventional airplane might have 2 ways of doing something. Concorde would have 3. Conventional airplane might have 3 ways of doing something, like lowering the undercarriage. Concorde would have 4. The airplane was very, very beautifully engineered, and she was such a delight to fly. And you always felt that you had, as I said earlier, a real thoroughbred in your hands, something that you could totally and utterly rely on.
Yeah. We've got a question from George. And again, it's for you, Mike. How did the later flights compare to the earlier ones with the advantage of improved avionics?
Oh, well, not much, because we didn't. We didn't improve the avionics. In the mid-90s, Concorde's an analog aeroplane. In the business, you know, we call all the gauges clockwork. She's of the generation 1950 to 1960, conventional gauges, conventional dials. In the mid-90s, we looked at taking all that lot out and putting new avionics in, TV screens, touch screen computers, all that sort of stuff. But we decided not to do that for a number of reasons. First of all, if it ain't broke, don't fix it. But secondly, it was the cost. Now, not the cost of the kit. The actual kit cost was relatively small to take the old stuff out and put new stuff in. It wasn't cheap, but it was relatively small. The real expense would have been in getting the airplane recertificated, because at that stage, the manufacturers no longer had their own Concorde. So the recertification process could have taken up to a year. So we, British Airways, would have had to take an airplane out of service for a year. Well, when you think about how much the Concorde could make when you're charging $10,000 or £10,000 round trip and you've got 100 passengers, it doesn't take long to work out how much revenue you'd lose if you took an airplane out for a year. So that's the real reason we didn't do it. But, you know, underscored by the fact it worked really well. and we all knew how to work it, and it was very reliable. So why change something that's working so well?
We all know that on Concorde you could see the curvature of the Earth and the sky above you was black. We've got a question from Gregory. What was the maximum height and speed Concorde ever achieved, with or without passengers on board?
Well, the maximum height with passengers on board was 60,000 feet. That was the limit. And the maximum speed that we did was 2.04. On test flights and in the testing phase of the airplane, we would go up higher than that. The highest I've ever been to is 62,700 feet. That was on a test flight. And the fastest I've ever been was 2.06. But that was because there are warnings on the systems if you go out beyond the normal flight envelope. So you need to have a warning to tell the crew that they've exceeded the limitations. On a test flight, you need to prove that warning works. So you deliberately go beyond the limitations to prove that the warning, whatever it might be, functions. So that's why we would take it outside the flight envelope and up to those altitudes and slightly faster.
And you could feel that little tremor when you went through Mach 2, couldn't you? It was a bit like putting your foot down in a very fast car, putting your foot down a little bit harder when you're on the motorway, and you feel that little tremor.
Yeah, to the extent that we'd actually say something on the public address to the passengers in the cabins, but when we switched the reheats on, you could actually feel the two slight nudges of acceleration in the back, and that was the only sensation of going supersonic. The going through the sound barrier itself was a total non-event, and apocryphally, George Edwards, who was the person on the British side of the project who drew everything together, was on a test flight early in the early stages of the testing program, one of the early ones when they had passengers on board. And on this particular test flight, had an 85-year-old lady, and at the end of the flight, he said to her, "Madam, have you enjoyed your trip on Concorde?" And she said, "Yes, I have, very much so, apart from being a little bit disappointed." And he said, "Disappointed, madam? Why were you disappointed?" So she said, "Well, when we went through the sound barrier, the aeroplane didn't shake." And he looked her straight in the eyes and said, "Madam, that is the clever bit." And so the only sensation of going supersonic was the nudges in the back from the reheats as we put the reheats in.
Wow.
Well, I can see that you've both got a little model Concorde in the background there. Yep. Mike, have you got the Lego Concorde?
Not the most recent one. I mean, I have got one, a Kobe Concorde, that was a bigger building blocks. But the most recent one, I can't get hold of. I mean, it's quite funny. I was chatting on Sunday, the actual anniversary of the last flight. We had a big event at Brooklands Museum near Weybridge where we've got a Concorde and the Concorde simulator. And one of the guests at that said to me, "Have you got the Lego Concorde?" I said, "No, I can't get one." He said, "No, nor can I." He said, "You know, they are going on eBay or other systems are available. They are going online at about 100% above the original price there because they're a limited edition." So I think if you want one and you can't get hold of one in the store, you're looking at paying something like £250 to £300, which is a lot of money for Lego bricks.
I'm glad I've got one now then.
Right, on that note, gentlemen, thank you both so much. That is all we have time for today, for everybody who's joined us, and it has been a record attendance today, which just goes to show what an iconic aircraft Concorde is still, and how much we all love her. I do hope everybody has enjoyed the show today, and a huge thank you to Mike and Brian for sharing so many wonderful memories. And Mike, a particular thanks to you for sharing so much of your archive of film and photography. We're really grateful. And Brian, for that lovely clip of the final takeoff of Concorde. Thank you so much for that. No problem. So this show will shortly be available on demand on the NATS YouTube channel, as well as an audio podcast in all the usual places. Do keep an eye out on our social channels for details of the next show. And as ever, if you have any questions or suggestions about topics, please let us know. We're going to leave you with a short video. We're going to turn our cameras off at this point because it's a proper tearjerker. A short video that really sums up what a special aircraft Concorde was, what she meant to the people who flew her and worked on her, and the special place she'll always have in all our hearts. Thanks, everyone.
It's just a magnificent looking aeroplane, and I just saw it just flying over our house, and I thought, wow. And every time it went over, I would run out and I would stand there until I couldn't see it anymore, and that's how it went on.
The enthusiasm never wanes. It's almost like every flight's your first flight. You know, you still get that cheesy grin on your face on takeoff, and it stays there till we touch down in New York.
As soon as you get close to it, you're just in awe at the shape of it. It's just a beautiful machine to look at.
There's sort of an area expectancy before the aircraft sort of pushes back and starts its takeoff roll, and that is very exciting when you put the afterburners on and you get the push in the back. It's fabulous.
Speedbird Concorde 1, you're clear for takeoff. 27 left, surface wind 240 at 10.
Speedbird Concorde 1, roger, clear for takeoff 27 left. Everybody ready? Yeah. 3, 2, 1, now.
Slam the throttles forward, the power starts to bite. Push back into your seat.
Airspeed's building.
Concentrating like mad.
60 knots.
The noise takes over.
100 knots. That's it.
All the calls come out from the engineer. The heart starts to pound a bit.
V1. Rotate. V2. Positive climb.
Before you know it, you're airborne. Just holding her back, you can feel she just wants to go.
It's just the most staggering experience. Everyone says it's going to be something you'll never forget for the rest of your life.
You can always recognise it, and it's almost, I know it sounds silly, but it looks like a swan. You know, when swans fly, it looks like a swan with the shape of its neck.
The outside is so elegant and causes gasps of amazement even after all this time. Every time something, oh, there's Concorde, there's Concorde.
You kind of think, oh, I wonder who might be on Concorde, maybe a famous film star who's just signed a contract in New York or something.
I can't remember exactly how many times I flew Concorde, year 2000, but it must have been maybe 30 times, and that's, 30 nights that you're not away from your kids.
As I looked out of the window, I could see the shadow of night falling across the planet, and we flew into this line. And, you don't get that anywhere other than in a spacecraft.
The most wonderful thing about Concorde is that no matter how many times you fly and you think you've become a jaded flyer, there still is that amazing, exciting sensation when you take off and when you're up in the air. You look out the window and you can't believe the speed at which you're traveling and the vista of the globe. It's really spectacular.
She's just a beautiful bird in the sky, and that is just where she belongs.